Well, welcome all. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Leah Shanley, Co-Executive Director of the South Big Data Innovation Hub at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And with me today is...
I'm Renata Rawlings-Goss, the other Co-Executive Director for the South Big Data Hub here at Georgia Tech.
Yep, and we're both here at Georgia Tech today. Wonder Twin Power, activate.
Right.
So for those of you who may not be familiar, the South Big Data Hub's mission is to serve as a catalyst and strengthen public-private partnerships, so connecting academic researchers, industry, government, and nonprofits to apply data science to regional and national challenges. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a few things. For those of you who tweet, please use the hashtag SBDH for South Big Data Hub 18, so SBDH 18, and hashtag BD Hubs will reach all the hub audience across all 4 hubs in the United States. We also have a Twitter account at South Big Data Hub. So welcome to the South Big Data Hub Data Science Roundtable series, which we host regularly. It's a monthly series that provides an open forum for exploring the emerging research challenges in data science and identifying potential solutions. Our discussion today focuses on the future of work, intelligent machines, automation, and societal impacts. Joining us is our moderator, Molly Kinder, who's a senior advisor of the future of work at New America, and 4 distinguished panelists. Molly is also a fellow at Georgetown University's Beek Center for Social Impact and Innovation, and adjunct faculty at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy, where she is teaching a graduate seminar on the social, economic, and policy implications of AI, and I'd love to take that class. Dr. Kevin Crouchton is a distinguished professor of information science in the School of Information Science at Syracuse University. He is currently serving as the Associate Dean for Research. His research examines new ways of organizing made possible by the extensive use of information and communications technology. And Kevin and I know each other also from the citizen science research community. Gordon Friedman is the president of the National Laboratory for Education Transformation. Throughout his career, Gordon has helped to evolve the fields of education technology and online learning, and is now an advocate for broad-based change across the K-to-career spectrum. Dr. Joanna Marin, please, can you, Joanna, can you give your name?
Yes, this is Ioana Marinescu.
Thank you, I apologize for my mispronunciation.
No.
She is the assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. As an economist, she studies the labor market to craft policies that can enhance employment, productivity, and economic security. And to close out our powerhouse of a panel today is Dr. Shade Shutters, who's a research scientist with the Global Security Initiatives at Arizona State University. He's also a PI on the West Big Data Hub, so exciting to have multi-hub participation. His research, funded primarily by the National Science Foundation and the Department of Defense, uses big data to understand the complex dynamics of urban systems and labor markets. So with that, I'll hand things over to Molly to moderate. Our panelists will get started with 5-minute opening remarks, followed by some moderated questions with Molly, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. What we've traditionally done with the Zoom is that if you have a question, to enter it in the chat box, and we will, Molly and the team will be monitoring chat for those questions. With that, Molly, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Leah. Well, I am absolutely delighted to be here with all of you. This is a fantastic panel that brings a wide array of expertise on both defining the problem and also thinking through some really important and innovative solutions. This is the issue that keeps me up at night and actually gets me to work in the morning. So it's both something that concerns me, but also is an issue that I'm really motivated to be part of at New America. We have a workers and technology team that I am part of, and in addition to some of my research that I started at Georgetown. And I imagine that those of you who've tuned in today for the discussion are tuning in for a very similar reason that all of us work on this, which is these questions of how technology, and particularly new and advancing technology like artificial intelligence, machine learning, advanced robotics, how these technologies are going to change work as we know it today and change the opportunities that our workforce have, but also what's required of them to be able to connect to that opportunity is a major societal question. And it's one that's top of mind of journalists, of policymakers, and of the public, frankly. So I'm sure many of you have seen any number of newspaper headlines about robots coming, and usually the newspaper headlines tend to be fairly negative in nature. And that mood is reflected in the public mood. So Pew did a poll that came out this past fall that showed that about double the amount of respondents in America express worry as opposed to enthusiasm about the role that this technology is going to play in work. And policymakers from mayors to governors to Congress are starting to wrap their heads around what this means and what we need to do to prepare. And hovering over all of this interest is this big policy question and research question, which is there something different today about the technology that's impacting work? Is this different than previous waves of technological revolution and innovation that we've had in the past? The anxiety is certainly not different. You can see newspaper headlines from 40 years ago, from 100 years ago that sound the same alarm bells that we're seeing today. But in previous waves of technology and automation, there has certainly been disruption and some displacement, but on net, jobs have continued to grow and prosperity has advanced. There is a question that everyone's grappling with is there something different about the nature of the technology that could be more disruptive and more transformative? And potentially on net, we'll see less jobs. Economists are pretty evenly divided on this for lots of reasons, and Shade is going to be turning to some of those questions in a moment. But even if you take the optimistic scenario, which is on net, we won't see a hemorrhaging of jobs. We'll still have enough work to go around. Still, that presents a pretty major challenge because while there isn't consensus on the net number of jobs we're going to be seeing, there are some other bits of consensus, which is that AI and technology will change jobs, maybe most jobs, and in some cases quite dramatically. It's also changing the skills and education required to connect to that opportunity, biasing away from routine, lower skilled, predictable work into more complex, cognitive, creative, and empathetic work. And even if the sort of on net work and prosperity is better off, there will certainly be strong distributional impacts, whether geographic, socioeconomic, or gender, for just to take a few. So we're going to dive into some of these questions. First, what do we know and what do we not know about how technology is going to impact work? And I'm especially excited that this panel has really brilliant minds on who are thinking about, well, what do we actually do about this? What are some innovative solutions that we can bring to the table, both from a policy point of view, but even from an innovation point of view as well. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Shade, who's going to walk us through a little bit more of this question of what do we know about how work is impacting, technology is impacting work. And I just want to reiterate the prompt in the beginning. To the extent you have questions that you want us to be responding to, please do fill it in on the chat and I'll be monitoring that. So turning it over to Shade.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you everyone for having me. This is a wonderful panel. Really looking forward to it. I'm going to try to go through a few things that I believe are generally well known and agreed upon, and then things that are not so well agreed upon. One of the places to start is simply that 3 million people globally every week move into cities, and the primary reason for that move is that they're looking for employment opportunities. So I think we all agree that globally the requirement or the need for productive jobs is extremely important, and that there's more and more pressure every day to have those jobs available. But at the same time, we are facing this massive transition, which Molly talked about. You can see it variously reported as things such as the fourth industrial revolution. I've seen it referred to as the second machine age. And so then we get into what's not agreed upon, and that is whether this is really something different than, let's say, the previous 3 industrial revolutions or the previous machine age. And one thing that I have seen a lot of people say distinguishes this from previous technological transformations is the fact that previously technology tended to replace human physical capabilities. And that this transition for the first time is seeing the replacement of human cognitive abilities. And so that, I think that is one thing that distinguishes this transformation from previous. However, it's still a big question in my mind, and probably most people who grapple with this, as to what that means. What does that mean to replace human cognitive abilities with machines and artificial intelligence? Does it enhance the ability of workers to do their job? Does it replace workers outright? And are we going to see this worst case scenario of hundreds of millions of people roving the planet in search of meaning and work? And are we going to have political issues around guaranteed basic income or certain remedies people are already talking about? And honestly, I don't know. And that's why I think these types of panel discussions are really important at this early stage of the transformation. And I do want to share just a couple slides to demonstrate some things that are not well agreed upon and some other things that are. Let me make sure this is working here. So there are a lot of reports from different agencies, for-profit companies, academics, that project the impacts of this coming transformation. One of the most widely cited academic papers is by a couple of authors at Oxford University, Fry and Osborne. The projected losses, according to their estimates, are shown on the right-hand column for just a couple selected occupations. On the other hand, these are the most recent job projection growth numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on the left hand. And so you can see there's quite a large disparity between some of the best case scenarios and some of the worst case scenarios. For instance, if you look at the personal care aides, projected losses using the Fry and Osborne estimates are over 500,000 jobs lost. And these are US numbers. So in the US, we would experience over 500,000 jobs lost, while the Bureau of Labor Statistics is still projecting increase of 750,000 jobs in the next 10 years. So these are both about 10 years out. And the point of this slide is just to give you an indication of how widely varying the estimates are of the impact of coming automation. On the other hand, one thing that I think most people do agree upon, and maybe not the actual percentages, but is this idea that the people that will be impacted most are those people with the least amount of education credentials. So forget for a moment the percentages that are attached to these bar graphs and look instead at just the relative magnitude. And I think that this general trend will probably hold true regardless of the scenario, that the more education you have, the more insulated you will be from being automated out of your job. So let me stop this here. And I hope that gives a little bit of ground for the rest of the discussion, a little perspective. And if there are more concrete questions, I think we'll answer that in the question and answer, but I want to give every other panelist a chance to introduce themselves now.
Great. We're going to turn to Kevin now, who's going to give us an overview of what do we still need to understand about the interplay between humans and machines, and what research questions that arises.
Great. Thank you very much. It's also a pleasure for me to be here today. I note, as Shay did, that a lot of the media attention around this issue of work and automation is really focusing on the notion of widespread job loss. And in contrast, what I want to call our attention to is how it's going to affect the work that people are actually doing, sort of the day-to-day, hour-to-hour kind of activity, you know, the place where people really spend most of their time. And the perspective I'm going to take on that is to consider a job as a collection of tasks that the workers have to perform. Of course, there's a lot more to work than just doing tasks, but that perspective I think is helpful in thinking about how the automation is going to have an impact. And so this is actually not a new way of thinking about things. For example, and I'm pulling up a slide here, the Department of Labor funded an effort to create a database of different kinds of jobs. And one of the things that that contains is a list of the tasks that are performed. So I just pulled up a random one, a cargo and freight agent. And you can see at the bottom that the database has listed 21 tasks. It's interesting to note, though, that there's very little theorizing about these tasks. In the database, it's just plain English descriptions. And in part, that's because there's a great diversity of tasks that are done. So I think one of the questions is just whether we can describe what work is in a somewhat more precise fashion. But this perspective is still useful in thinking about the impacts of automation because the tasks are different in how automatable they are. And in answer to the question of what's different this time, I think one thing we can see is that, as Shade mentioned, the kinds of things that can be automated have shifted from purely physical, applying more energy, to sort of routine data processing. You'll notice the top one here is just keep records, something that machines are much better at than people, to more intellectual kinds of things, like picking the right method for shipping, estimating postal rates, and so on. And another thing which we're also seeing is an increase in the way that the machines and the humans communicate. And then on the other side, the right-hand side, we have a list of things that are still likely going to be difficult, in some cases because it's you know, sort of these detailed physical activities like sticking labels on boxes, which might be a little bit harder for arbitrary sized boxes, or installing things inside of an airplane. There's also working with other people, coordination, something which maybe the machines are not immediately going to be good at. But again, one of the things that's changing is more and more things are moving from the right to the left as the technology improves. So this perspective is the basis for various kinds of analyses. The one that was mentioned earlier about what % of jobs could be automated was done based on basically an examination of these sorts of kinds of databases. And so it also helps us to see some of the impacts. So first of all, if we get rid of the stuff on the left, give it to a machine, that implies maybe we need fewer people to do the smaller amount of work that's left on the right. It also has clear implications for the kinds of skills that are needed. If you notice, the things on the right might be ones that do require either more education, more emotional intelligence, more managerial ability. And it also could be that we start to see redistributions of these tasks. So new kinds of organizations of the work, as for example, the tasks get distributed differently across different kinds of jobs. The thing I want to point out, though, is that this shift of the automation has impacts just that go beyond just how much there is and who gets to do it. For one thing, as has been noted by lots of people, there are going to be new kinds of jobs that are created by the automation. So, you know, developing systems, maintaining them, programming robots, and so on. But I think it's also important to note that as that connection between the left and the right gets worked out, there's going to be new tasks that get created that didn't exist before to manage that relationship between the humans and the technology. So it's not just a simple case that, you know, if you take a set of tasks to give one to person A, one to machine B, that the tasks stay the same, that there's going to be this additional work that the humans are going to have to do in order to deal with the technology. And we've seen that in previous generations of automation, just with routine information processing, creating all of these jobs that basically interface between the system and customers of the organization, for example, or between the system and the real world. In fact, you even see that in the list of tasks that I showed on the previous slide. There's a set of tasks around monitoring and maintaining the system. So for example, if you thought about a freight forwarding clerk using one of these systems, making sure that the tables of prices or routing is kept up to date. It's a huge amount of work, and part of the reason why the automation is sometimes slow to get installed. And there can even, interestingly, be upskilling requirements as the humans who are now on the outskirts of this automated central system need to have a much, much deeper understanding of how the system works to be able to debug problems as they arise. So what that implies in terms of research is just a need for understanding, not at the level of entire job classes or hundreds of thousands of workers, the kind of gross economic statistics that are being collected or hypothesized, but really very detailed understandings of what's happening. And one advantage is that we can actually already see it happening in certain bellwether settings, places where the payoffs for the automation are higher and where there's more money. So in finance, for example, where better decision-making can really have $1 million impacts, there's been a lot of investment. So what were the design choices that people had about these tasks and their assignment? What has the impact of this been on a variety of outcomes? There's a lot of emphasis looking at this just from the point of view of efficiency, but I think we also need to think about worker learning, well-being. We need to think about these impacts at a group level. What happens to a group of workers when part of the work is now being done by machines? I think a very interesting set of questions is around the kind of relationships. We tend to think of this very much in the terms of automation of just replacing, but you could think about it as an apprentice, someone that you're training and is going to get better over time, an aid, and a symbiote. If we really think about the potential for not just replacing humans, but augmenting them, what kind of a relationship does that look like? And so in general, how do we make sure that we effectively design these interactions at the frontier in order to get the most benefit, not just in terms of economic efficiency, but also in terms of worker abilities? So that would be my call for action. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Great, thanks, Kevin. That's really fascinating, and it's helpful to see a specific occupation and how those skills are shifting. Gordon, we'd love to bring you in, and you have a unique perspective in how data and data standards need to be part of this conversation.
I can pick up from where Kevin left off in that these aren't binary considerations of whether it's a robot or whether it's a human. We're evolving into a culture the same way that a 3 or 4 year old who picks up a smartphone and starts playing with it, by the time they get to kindergarten, it would be hard to know which part of them's the machine and which part of them is the human. I mean, we're entering a culture where these things are mixed. And the nonprofit that I founded and run, the National Lab for Education Transformation, is designed really to bring workforce training and education into the world that we're already in and how we compute and do things socially. So our whole effort is to look at what's necessary. So if you think about this issue of automation, one of the key points is humans and machines and algorithms are all going to have to live together. And the question is, well, how would we do that? So right now, we have some very fundamental problems in the job markets and the education markets, and that is when you attend college or a training program, there's very little data on what you've done or the labor code standards or any of the other things that might say what you've done, what courses or training you've consumed, and then where you end up in the labor market. So right now, when you go shopping online or you go to Expedia and order something, all this co-processing is happening. So the work that we're engaged in is to say, what do the underlying data standards look like? How do we move data from one place to another? How can effectively we move from a binary situation where robots might be doing a lot of work, we're not actually communicating with them, the data doesn't flow back and forth. So you can imagine in workflows in the future where we're intimately involved with different machine processes, that's going to have to run on data standards. So there are a number of efforts nationally to look at how we define skills and how we get those into data and metadata. But the transport data, how we move this around, is not really it's not really at a very high level. The other thing I want to think about is, again, it's not us and them. We've created them. So the question is, are there robots, especially with people, as Shade mentioned, whose jobs are at risk, or the opportunity youth in the 16 to 24 category? Are there robots that can actually help them find work? So in other words, if you're a 17-year-old without work and not in school, where do you go today? And I think anybody on this call widely would have a hard time saying, well, where does that person go to find a job? Where do they go to find the training they need for a job? So I don't think we're deploying robots right now to assist people in finding work. And then that work may be work where they're working with a robot, right? Or they're co-constructing something. So basically our work is to say, what's the data infrastructure all of this is going to run on? What are the standards? And we're involved in a number of efforts to get people to look at those issues so that these conversations become much more realistic in terms of what can be done and what can't be done. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Gordon. That's really interesting. Ioana, I'm excited to bring you into the conversation as we now shift. Gordon did a nice job of teeing up some potential solutions. So Gordon was talking about how do we leverage data and robots to actually help people connect with opportunity. A lot of the anticipating that we may be facing, that individual workers are going to face disruption, whether outright displacement or periods of unemployment or underemployment as they're switching occupations or skills. There's been a lot of interest in sort of safety nets and how do we think about supporting workers through different transitions. One of the ones that gets a lot of attention is universal basic income. So I'm delighted to bring you into the conversation to speak a little bit about your research, which looks both at, shed some new insights onto some of the debates about universal basic income, but also looks at various policy levers for supporting economic security.
Great, I'm very happy to join this conversation to talk to you about some policy options. So first of all, as you have gathered probably from our prior participants, knowing exactly what's going to happen to workers is very hard. But I think it's fair to say that there's probably going to be an increase in risk and uncertainty, and that it's important to think about policy options, how we might be prepared to deal with this kind of situation. And indeed, the idea of a universal basic income, which let me just first redefine what we're talking about here. It's the idea of giving everyone in a territory cash with no strings attached, with no conditions, so everyone gets this transfer. As such, this is a transfer, therefore, that provides an always there bed of economic security to everyone. And so that's in large parts the reason why this idea is appealing when we are facing so much uncertainty from technological change and how it might affect jobs and workers' livelihoods. So my own research looks at some of the impacts of basic income style policies that have been done in the past. And so before I talk about my own most recent research, I just want to give our listeners an overview of what's been found before. This idea is not new. It's been around for at least a couple of centuries. And in fact, in the 70s, the government in the US wanted to have a basic income style transfer, which was called a negative income tax, which is a specific type of basic income. And they wanted to do that, and they run some experiments to understand what the impacts would be. And then there's been additional other experiments and research. And just to summarize what has been found, the most important finding, perhaps, because here we're talking about work, is that you might be worried that if we give everyone money with no conditions, then why work, right? You can just sit home and relax, because what's the point? So these studies have looked at that, the impact on work, and perhaps surprisingly, they found oftentimes no impact at all. And sometimes a small, reduction in hours, but not very large. So the impact ranged from 0 to a small reduction in hours. And that's very interesting to know for us in case we're worried about some of the downfalls of this policy. Now, there were also positives, and they have found important positive impacts on education and health, especially for the most disadvantaged youth. So that's the picture of what's been done before, and that's where my new work on Alaska comes in. So it turns out that Alaska, which is a US state, has had transfer scheme like a basic income. It's not called a basic income, it's the permanent fund dividend. So it comes from Alaskan money that was put into this fund from oil and minerals. They have a sovereign fund, which is basically a fund that's invested in a diversified portfolio. The dividend from this fund comes every year to every Alaskan. Anyone who has lived in Alaska for a year, anyone who's legal, including refugees, is entitled to this transfer. So we've been looking with my co-author Damon Jones at the University of Chicago at the impact of this on work in Alaska. And the reason why this is new and different from what's been done before is because this is a transfer that everyone in Alaska gets, while prior studies were small-scale experiments, just a few people. So here we're able to look at the whole of Alaska and compare it with similar states and see if after Alaskans started receiving this transfer, they stopped working or what. And so basically what we find is that this transfer has been going on for 30 years. So it's really, if something was going to happen, it would have happened. And basically we find no effect at all on employment. Alaskans are no less likely to be employed than residents of other similar states, but they did increase their part-time work. And so consistent with some of the prior research, there is some reduction in hours for some people. But in terms of overall employment, we find a zero effect. And then we go on to argue that likely the zero effect is due to the fact that when you give people money, it has an impact on the economy, which is a positive impact. So if you think about local restaurants, for example, as people get a lot of cash, some of this cash goes into spending locally in restaurants. So these restaurants now need to hire more cooks and waiters in order to satisfy this demand. And this effect is positive and can countervail any negative effect from just giving cash to people. So we believe that this cash stimulates the economy, and therefore the overall effect on work is more positive than you might have thought if you were just looking at every individual in isolation. So in conclusion, I think there's much more research to be done, but certainly the effects of basic income style programs that have happened before are mostly positive, and certainly the effects on work, again, are zero to small. And as such, I feel this is a policy that's worth thinking more about in our arsenal of possible ways of dealing with economic insecurity that arises from the progress of artificial intelligence.
Great, thanks, Ioana. It's encouraging to hear that your research is indicating that this might have a positive impact. Staying on this theme of solutions, since I think there's so much fear about this issue, it's helpful to hear big ideas for what can be done. Gordon, I wanted to go back to you. You're in your work, you've done a lot of rethinking education and working with the education system. What's your view of how education and training needs to be reimagined, given some of the issues that both Kevin and Shade have raised?
Well, in the United States, we have institutions and employers very different than what you would see in Europe, where you have a real human capital model. And a human capital model would say that education, training, and work and personal development, social interaction, they're all part of the same fabric. The problem that we have in the United States is that we don't have this point of view, even though human capital theory came out of the United States. So what has to happen is that you can have a situation in K-12, as an example, we don't do big data analyses in K-12. So we're looking at comparative data across K-12. We know from the work of Raj Chetty and others that, that third graders, if you're not doing well in third grade in math and English, you can look at trajectory forward. So why aren't we doing something about that? Why isn't that family in some kind of a system? Now, just yesterday, there's a San Diego school district that by the time you're in 8th grade, you will have been exposed to 54 different careers. Now, if they move that student into what I would call a universal transcript, so their exploration of what they do in school and the standards, what they do outside, that becomes a form of data. Then you look at when that student gets ready to explore work or college, again, by the data, we have to have an ability to give them a view of what's possible, what to explore. One of the largest problems we face, and I think this is the advantage that the machines have, is that most people don't know what the skill-based jobs are today. So there are plenty of open jobs that pay up to $100,000 where you may not need a high school, college a BA, but you might need some training. Well, most people don't know what these jobs are. So one of the other things we're looking at is how can we have media that's informing learners and teachers on what's out there. The final piece of this happens at the university level or community college level. We have plenty of economic outcome data looking, as Shade pointed out, on people's educational levels, but now we're going to have more data on their training and so forth. But at a community college where there are occupational programs, we're lining up people with work, but we're not using data systems to do it. So again, we're looking at how you get into the data of courses and occupational programs and looking at their outcomes, getting those again in some kind of database that can look at things. Now, flip over to the employer side, where we already know that a bachelor's degree may not be required for many jobs and that there are other issues they're looking at. How do they look into the education pipeline and see what they're doing? And finally, let me just end that we have a problem that's international and it's exacerbated in the United States, that we have a high number of 16 to 24-year-olds who are not in education and they're not in the workforce. Reaching them, giving them a voice. So part of our work is to think about how social media vehicles with data behind them and media can start playing a role. So back to my original point, we haven't made a culture for this. We certainly have made a social interaction culture on the web. We certainly have done things that help people that have careers through LinkedIn and other things, but we don't have the mechanisms yet. So that's what we're looking at. I hope that answered the question.
Great, thanks, Gordon, I appreciate it. Kevin, I was really struck in your excellent presentation that a clear takeaway, it seems, of going beyond just the headlines of job losses or looking at the overall risk of a specific occupation, but taking it down a step into looking at the specific tasks, some of which might be displaced by technology, but others, the task nature shifts. What do you think the policy implications of that are? So what is that in terms of the trends you're seeing in the kind of skill shift? What does that say about both the kind of foundational skills that we need to make sure all workers are getting, but then the specific skills that are related to that job? So you mentioned, for instance, emotional interpersonal skills being more of a foundational skill, but then there might be some specific skills of learning to work with the specific technology that's coming to play. So I'm curious, taking a step back from your presentation, you know, right, what does that imply from a how we need to better prepare workers?
It's an interesting question, and I think a really important one. I'm not really that much of a policy person, and so it's a little difficult for me to answer. I think one clear implication, as you said, is that there are certain sets of skills that are likely to be less automatable in the sort of near and medium term, and so making sure that people are able with those, I think, is important. And I think that is an area where there could be quite some concern, because many of the things that the machines find hard to do, quite a number of people also find hard to do. So you mentioned emotional intelligence, for example. You know, there's a variation in the population, and if that turns out to be a key skill, then people who are lower in that would obviously be disadvantaged. And it's actually an interesting question whether that's something that can be trained or not, but it may be that understanding the extent to which it can be trained and making sure that that's built into educational systems is important. The other thing which is very clear is the ability to work with a system and understand what's going on inside the system is going to be important. And I think that's also quite problematic, because the kind of opportunities that people would have historically had for learning how, you know, the complicated system that their organization implements, a lot of that would have been on the job, right? That you would have started off as an entry-level person doing work, and moved your way up, and as a result, personally experienced a lot of those things. And to the extent that that kind of entry-level assistance sort of stuff is actually automated, it's, I think, very difficult because you don't have that pipeline in. You know, you need to come in with a certain level of expertise. And so I think that that also has some implications. There is an ability that certain people have to, you know, be able to understand the complexities, even though they're hidden inside of a system. But thinking about how you train that kind of skill, sometimes people focus a lot on computational thinking and reduce it to programming. And I think thinking about computational thinking in a sort of broader sense, not of being able to necessarily create programs, but to be able to understand how things are actually being implemented inside of a system, even when some of the internal workings are hidden. I think that's probably a trainable skill, but I don't know exactly, you know, it doesn't have a nice, neat label and a set of courses behind it. But I think you can see it, for example, when kids very, very quickly pick up video games and they're able to understand the mechanism that the video game has implemented in a very quick way. So helping people to build those sorts of skills around work systems, I think, would be interesting also.
It's great. Kevin, you say you aren't a policy expert, but that's, that's a great list of policy implications. I was struck by your point about young people and career ladders, this notion of getting in on a rung and being able to advance.
Right.
The OECD just this past month came out with a big new report on automation, and the OECD, one of their key policy findings is that there's a U-shape of risk, and that young people under 25 are particularly vulnerable because so many of those jobs that don't require any prior training, like I was a cashier at Wegmans when I was in high school, you know, you just get trained on the job. Those tend to be some of the jobs most vulnerable to computerization and automation. So I think it does raise an interesting question of, for some people, that cashier job led to a management position inside a grocery store. Others, it was just your early work experience and you paid for college, or you were sort of learning the work environment. So what happens?
You were demonstrating that you were a reliable person, that you would show up on time, do your hours. So.
Right, so exactly. So I put this in the category of, yes, there may be enough work to go around, but there's going to be distributional winners and losers, and young people and the less skilled are going to be in that category of, we may have to rethink how we are giving them opportunity if some of those basic entry-level positions are the ones more likely to go away.
But I think there's actually also a further detail of it. There's a book, Only Humans, No Humans Need Apply, which people may have read. One of the examples they give is entry-level architects used to spend their days drawing the diagrams, and every time you needed a change, someone would have to redraw it. And so it's really boring, tedious work, but it was the starting position for a lot of architects. Now people have CAD systems. That entire, the room full of people doing drafting have disappeared. But those were the entry-level jobs that got you into the firm and got you trained up in the actual practice of being an architect. So if those kinds of early experiences that let you be a real member of the organization, if those don't exist, if you have to start off at a much more expert level, then it's going to have to be a different way of thinking about how people get into professions, not just into the world of work, but into the specific work of a profession.
That's great. And I've heard similar examples with law, with the folks who sort of had entry-level, search positions that are being automated. So it's a good question. Yep. I'm going to be turning momentarily to the audience. We have at least one question that's come, but before I do that, I just want to quickly go back to you, Juana. You have some additional work beyond your work looking at universal basic income that's looking at other ways of providing economic security, including through unemployment. So I would just love to give you the floor to give us an insight into some of those policies as well. And then I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are coming in.
Right. So in thinking about how we are going to adapt to these new challenges coming from technologies, some of the people who might be losing jobs had jobs before, and those people are typically those who would be getting unemployment insurance. And so we have to think about the design of unemployment insurance and what is required of people when they are on unemployment insurance, for example, in terms of training and job search requirements. And some of my research is specifically understanding the amount of job search that people need to do while they are unemployed. And the big message of that is that it is important to require people to job search because otherwise it can be difficult for people to actually do it because it's such a depressing activity. It has been found in the literature, but that requiring an excessive or above and beyond level of job search is very ineffective. Because in the end, people aren't able to find better jobs. And in fact, it's a little bit a mechanism of beggar thy neighbor, where if I search harder, I get in that job first and you don't, but overall, the level of unemployment doesn't change. So, you know, you have to think about, just as I was saying earlier with Alaska, when we're giving money to everyone, we have to think about how it affects the economy. Similarly, when we think about an unemployment insurance design and who should be getting the money under what conditions, we shouldn't only focus on the individual, but on how it's going to affect the economy and are we going to be able to durably reduce unemployment through whatever requirements we have for people who are on unemployment insurance. And one interesting example that a PhD student here at Penn has been working on is this trade adjustment help that some workers get when they've been become unemployed because of trade, and then they can get retraining from that's paid for by the government. And so this program, for example, has been shown to be quite effective in helping people who qualify to find jobs faster and better jobs. So there are certainly options that have been tried that we can learn from in terms of facing future challenges.
Great, thanks, Joanna. So I'm going to turn to some questions that Eric has posed. It's in two parts. So let me read this, and then I'll turn to the panelists. Is it a zero-sum game with redistribution of work controlled by training? Past transformations have left a large group of people demoted from the middle class to low-income class and often poverty. Eric raises a really good point. So I'm not sure if some of you have followed David Otter from MIT's work. He's looked a lot at past, say, 30 plus years of technological automation and has found a polarization of wages because of technology. So a lot of formerly middle class jobs, clerical jobs replaced by email and Microsoft Word type applications, manufacturing, which was a middle wage job. It was the middle skill jobs that were most impacted by technology. Some of those folks acquired more skills and moved up into higher paying jobs, and quite a few of them dropped down to more low paid service jobs. So there is a big question about the current wave of automation. Is this one that is similarly going to impact middle skilled workers and polarizing in the ways where the rich get wealthier and a lot of people fall down to poverty? Or actually, I think going to Shade's slides about actually the lowest wage workers are the most vulnerable. So we would see income inequality potentially growing, but not necessarily the same impact of displacing the middle. So Shade, why don't I turn this over to you? I'm curious about your perspectives of whether this type of automation follows previous waves, and what is that going to say about whether this is zero sum and how it's going to impact inequality?
Sure, and I am familiar with the work on the past transitions, and everything that I've seen indicates that this one is more towards the low end of the wage spectrum, unlike previous ones. And one thing that worries me is a recent Price Waterhouse report estimated that automation was going to have the benefit in the next 10 years of increasing global GDP by almost $16 trillion per year. But the concern is that massive bump in GDP will be shared by an ever shrinking number of workers, if you believe the estimates of automation displacement. And so what you'll see globally is a really rapid acceleration of wage inequality. And that has repercussions far beyond just the economic realm. I think Leah said earlier, I work a lot with the US Department of Defense, and they've identified unemployment among working age males in developing countries as a primary driver of terrorism. And so these accelerations of inequality and potential unemployment are potentially a serious concern. And so, and I also want to go back to something Ioana said. We're researching these topics at Arizona State right now about how effective global basic, guaranteed basic income would be in mitigating those effects. And one of the interesting findings is that for people that were displaced involuntarily, sometimes that income is still not enough to replace the meaning in their lives that work provided beyond just income. And so I think as policymakers struggle with how to deal with people that are displaced, there has to be a discussion beyond just replacing their lost wages, but something that's a little more difficult, replacing this meaning in their lives.
Yeah, Shade, I couldn't agree with you more on that. We've got a few more great questions coming from.
Can I make one comment?
Please jump in, Kevin.
So I think it's important to separate the impacts on the skill level with the impacts on income. I think, as Ioana's research points out, the questions about income are not technologically driven. They're choices that we make either managerially within organizations or as a society. And so, the increase in polarization of salaries is already happening. It's been happening for a while. I don't think the complete driver now is technological. It's policy decisions that are being made about letting people with lots of income set rules that allow them to concentrate even more of the wealth. And so these questions about wealth, I think, and wealth disparities need to be separated from the skill questions. The skill questions are quite important. If you need an increasing level of skill just to get a job, that is the problem that needs to be addressed. But I think income is a political question as much as it is technological.
Yeah, Kevin, I think that's a good point. And just wearing my sort of nerdy economist hat, income is in part driven by scarcity of skills and the sort of gap between demand. And so that is one of my big concerns is when you look at some of the occupations that are highest risk, they're all related to each other in skills. And then to get, the predictions are most of the jobs that will be created on net will require higher education and skills than the ones going away. So if there's a pent up demand for lots of very skilled labor and not enough supply, that will drive income increases. And on the flip side, if what Shade is saying is correct, that some of the lowest skilled and lowest wage workers are most vulnerable, and automation could be impacting a lot of occupations at the same time. I think that does not speak well for the markets delivering higher wages. But I agree that there's clearly political ways to intervene. So we have
sorry for interrupting. Just a quick point to say that there's actually been some new research that I just put in our chat mode there.
I saw this, yes.
By Eric Brynjolfsson and co-authors from MIT, showing that certainly according to their predictions, the latest machine learning wave is going to impact similarly occupations at every level of income. And that's part of what we were talking before about legal secretaries and maybe lawyers and maybe doctors. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And I do want to point out that not everyone agrees that it's all going to be lopsided and affect more those with lower skills. So, I encourage you
I think that's right.
That paper, which I think is quite thought-provoking.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think there's different time lags. I think for some of the higher skill jobs to be automated, the technology is going to have to get a lot better than it is today. So the MIT folks are techno optimists that we'll get there. Okay, so let me turn to some of these great questions that we're getting. I think it's Megan. Sorry, your name has been cut off in mine. Can you share what you think are some of the most pressing research questions at the intersection of your disciplines? Where do you see the most transformative opportunities in the research landscape? I like this notion of intersection, so not in sort of one discipline, but where are some of the sort of transformative opportunities that might cross disciplinary boundaries? I'm not sure if anyone has, Gordon, Kevin, anyone you wanna?
Yeah, let me jump in. Our work is primarily building cross-sector teams to look at these problems. And I think that if you look at the work of the OECD, which is great, even though we're the largest contributor to them, we are the least of the consumers. And so I think we don't have this dialogue cast at the right level. And so for the research intersections, we have, in the United States, we have a lot of organizations that compete and kind of jockey to be, oh, I'm the guy who's going to figure out training, or our organization knows this better than somebody else. So I think we need, on the intersection side, to have a sort of a larger scale collaboration. So what we're doing today is just part of a larger national conversation where we organize it. So I think there's tremendous intersections. And again, I'm going to go back to data. We've got a lot of data, but we don't have organizations that are bringing it together, pointed at these questions in a way that can be tested and scaled. So my vote is to get kind of a deeper set of collaborations and invite people in, take what we're doing today and make it some kind of uniform activity.
Great. Thanks, please, Kevin, go ahead.
I'm going to put up a slide. So with some colleagues, we recently got funding from National Science Foundation to run a research coordination network, which we're calling Work in the Age of Intelligent Machines. Mm-hmm. So RCN is an interesting funding mechanism because it does not actually pay to do research. So it doesn't really answer the call from Gordon, but it does pay to bring people together. And so we're trying to build a network of cross-disciplinary researchers who are interested in this, and hopefully by bringing people together, create some of those multidisciplinary research projects. So we have money to pay for workshops. We're going to have a conference coming up, the first one, 18th and 19th of May at Michigan State. And we're also hoping that this will be a vehicle for sharing resources. So I was very interested to hear, for example, that you have a course. I think sharing syllabi and getting other people to be able to teach similar courses would be great. So the network, the URL is wame.network. And so I just wanted to put that up there to invite, well, first of all of you, but also the people in the audience who might be interested to join. And so with that, I will stop sharing.
Great, thanks, Kevin. That's really practical and very helpful. Before I turn to the next, did you have something to add? Okay, great, because we've got a few more questions here. Great question from Ritzy. It would be interesting to hear the panelists' perspective on the sectors where they anticipate new jobs might arise. The difficult perspective is often within, the default perspective is often healthcare and IT, but as we know, displaced workers may not all turn into these sectors. So, and I would just want to concede that most of the energy in the predictions around automation is what jobs are at risk, not necessarily the ones that are on the rise. And that's a challenge I face in my own research. So Shade or others, does anyone have thoughts about the more positive side, whether it's jobs directly created by technology or that might be created across the economy as productivity turns into higher wages?
So I think the question asker got the main two sectors that are enhanced by technological needs of the workers, or skills of the workers. On the other hand, there's another sector that I've heard a lot of people or read a lot that should be enhanced in terms of increased employment, and that is any occupation that requiring interpersonal skills, personal touch, and partly that is driven by demand, but also by, as Kevin put it, certain skills that tend not to be automatable. So anything that requires face-to-face communication, interpersonal interactions are, let's say, less at risk than we might think, or possibly will increase in demand. And I know that's not a perfect answer, but it's an additional sector to keep an eye on.
That's great. Kevin, did you want to join?
I think there's also, if you think about the work being partly automated, there's going to be a bunch of jobs for people monitoring automation. So BBC had an interesting article about a job called Robot Wrangler. I forget which company it was, but they're using robots to do last mile food delivery. And so basically there's a room full of people sitting at monitors watching the robots and then, intervening when some kind of problem arises. And so that kind of shift from people actually doing things to people monitoring the systems doing things and then stepping in when they don't do it quite right. I think you might see that pattern repeat across a number of different sectors.
That's great. Thanks, Kevin. Daryl had a great question on the challenge of the different time scales for the problem. So the rate at which jobs are lost versus the length of training or on-ramps to careers. What tensions arise and how do we think about some of that? Gordon, I'm not sure if some of your education work might be helpful in answering that. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Can you restate that real quickly?
Yeah, so there's the different time scale. So the pace at which jobs might change.
Oh, yeah. So
the length of
this
time. Yeah.
This is a huge problem. So we're deeply involved with the workforce development community colleges, and they typically get a couple breakfasts a year with employers to decide what occupational programs to put together. Then it takes 12 to 18 months to make that program, at which time it's very possible the jobs don't exist anymore. So we've worked and we are working, and we invite anybody to help us on a project called Job Signals to try to get employers to almost like tweet little bits of pieces of information about demand formation, because by the time something is in a job posting and it's gone through HR, A, it has very little relevant information in it, and B, it's way too late. So we need to know regionally, because reality is regional, what employers are thinking about. Those signals need to travel both to the occupational and high school programs and to learners. So we're looking at all steps in how we can speed this up. But that's one that probably isn't difficult, and with the right kind of experimentation, we can see if we could speed that process up.
Shay, did you want to join?
Yeah, I just want to add that since I started working on this topic, probably the most eye-opening thing that I have discovered has been from working with industry partners, sort of canvassing them, some focus groups, and coming to the realization that in parallel to this transformation of workers and automation, there will need to be a revolution, let's say, in education. And the general consensus that was sort of shocking to me from industry was hearing them say that in, let's say, 10, 15 years, they probably wouldn't even value seeing a bachelor's and a master's on a person's resume. That the 500-year-old model of higher education was just too slow in today's rapidly changing skill requirement environment, and that they perceived what was needed was something like a lifelong credentialing system where workers don't go off and get a degree and coast along for 20 years on what they learned. They're continuously updating every couple years their list of skills, and that what they would want to see in the future on a person's resume were a list of credentials and not degrees. And so to the questioner's question, there needs to be a completely different time scale applied to the acquisition of skills, I believe.
Yep, Shay, you've done a great job of teeing up our next question, which is how is academia helping students today ensure they have the skills needed, or maybe we should say how they're not helping. A good example of a leader in this is Singapore, which is an often cited example. Singapore has really embraced technology and automation, but made a commitment to do exactly this kind of lifelong learning, upskilling. There's everyone over a certain age gets access to funding. I think it's $500 for classes. The National University pivoted to create more of these shorter skill-related courses that working adults can go back and learn. So that's an example I would just throw out of a country that's taking that seriously. But I'm not sure if other panelists, this question of how academia is or is not shifting, what do we need to do? Gordon, please jump in.
So in our country, in San Diego, we have the National University. They have set up a precision institute, and they've taken their courses and they're starting to migrate them into a big data system, unlike a learning management system, which allows them to link labor data with almost everything that goes into that course. And those students, as they're going through the course, have the ability in a much more, almost like a fabric. They're using data from MZ on the labor markets. And my sense is that we can, in the United States, do a fairly good job on getting courses to just line up with labor data. We may not be able to get faculty to get down to the level of, oh, I'm going to help you find a job. But we certainly can let the data do it. And National University, it's nu.edu/precision, is doing a really nice job on exploring this question.
It's great. You want to?
Yeah, so that's always a difficult question, because if you think about economics, we learn about general and specific training. And so when the environment changes a lot and you might have to do different jobs, it's important to have general training, which serves as a baseline to be able to retrain, whether on the job or with additional training. And so I think what's hard is to get that balance right in terms of equipping students with enough general skills that they can later on build on and use in different jobs, and at the same time enough relevant skills in terms of what's demanded by the market right now. And getting those two right is no easy matter, because we can use better and more information on the skills that are demanded by the market right now. And I think the technology, and Gordon and I have worked on this, is more and more available for us to do a much better job at that. But while doing that, we also have to keep in mind that, as others have pointed out, demand is rapidly changing. And so we also have to make sure to build for students a bedrock of solid, general training and general skills that they can use down the line.
Great. I'm hopeful. Please go ahead, Kevin.
I would actually add to that a meta skill of being able to train themselves. Our students often come in saying, oh, I want to learn Office 2018. And we say, yeah, but you're going to graduate in 2022. So really, one of the lifelong skills is being able to find a new system and teach yourself how to use it. And so I think those sorts of, I would really echo what Joanna said, the bedrock, but also the meta skills to be able to adapt to change.
Great. I'm conscious of time, so I'm hopeful we can keep these next few answers brief so that I can get through all the questions. Somebody anonymous asked the $1 million hard question, which is, as for training and retraining, how do we approach the situation where we need to retrain someone like a truck driver whose skills are not transferable? I would add into that if we believe some of the stats about lower skilled jobs and less educated jobs being more vulnerable, the research suggests that lower educated and lower skilled people take advantage of retraining and further education less than those with higher education, which is fairly intuitive, because if you love studying, you probably would have, pursued education to begin with. So how do we deal with that conundrum, that those who tend to seek and thrive in retraining and adult learning situations are A, not the ones who are most vulnerable, and B, that So does anyone have thoughts on that really, really naughty, tough question?
I don't want to keep reacting, but again, the exploration of getting some of this more into social media so that people are communicating with each other is essential, and we're looking at that issue. And I think it's going to have to cross over into something that's more in the consumer space. So in other words, we don't have a LinkedIn right now that a lot of people on some of these jobs would be coming in. And that truck driver, by the way, if they've been professionally trained, there are all kinds of skills that can be unpacked there. So so the necessity of doing this, there's the notion of a universal transcript that would be able to have your training, your skills, your academic certifications. I think something like that is going to become very useful, especially, again, if it can be shared and then people can communicate with that person.
Great. I'm going to do a little bit of a rapid fire because I want to get through some of these. Renata asked Gordon and Shade, are you working with any technical or community colleges to provide skill-based AI to help with worker placement? If not, do you know groups who are? And let me just keep going with a few more so we can respond. How do you legitimize the lifelong skills in the US? The major universities have also had 500 years to build a reputation. What about some of these newer providers? And last, let me just try to get them all in so we can respond. There was a good one up here. Oh, question for Kevin. What are the most exciting research questions in computer science regarding future of work? So I've just thrown a bunch out there in our remaining 4 minutes. If you can be pithy and try to respond to some, that would be great. And actually, even less, because I think we need some follow-up remarks. So let's be like lightning fast.
So lightning fast. I think figuring out how to make computers productive team members so that you can have a team that has people and the bots and they're working together productively? I think that's a really interesting question.
Fascinating.
I'll throw out a, go ahead, Gordon.
I'm just going to throw out a URL, www.skillscommons.org. This is to the community college question. It's a repository with thousands of courses in it. We are now working to make that machine readable, and so you could apply AI to it.
And I'll just throw out an example that answers 2 or 3 of these questions. At Arizona State, we're experimenting with including AI in the delivery of education itself. We're slowly making all of our curriculum available through online courses. But as a student takes that through an online platform, there's an AI engine in the background that is customizing it as they go through the process. So it's almost individualized for every person that takes it. And thinking of that truck driver, we could extend that model to take them through not just educational opportunities tailored to them, but things of interest. Learn about what skills they have, what interests they have, and try to make that person disinclined to transferring their skills more inclined.
Great. Wonderful. Leah, I'm going to turn this back over to you with a huge thanks to all the panelists. I really enjoyed the conversation and to the great questions.
Okay, thank you all. And I think this will be the first of several series of roundtables on the future of work. I hope to be collaborating with all the panelists on this, including discussions about putting out a white paper on the emerging research issues. I want to thank all the panelists and the moderator for an outstanding job, and thank you, audience, for participating. We do have a few announcements for the South Big Data Hub. The first is Microsoft Azure training at the Renaissance Computing Institute in Chapel Hill on Tuesday, May 2nd. That is part of the South Hub's partnership with Microsoft Research, and it is pre-training. Full-day workshop offers a chance to learn about the fundamentals of Azure for research training and to talk one-on-one with Azure experts, software, the systems architects, etc., about your specific project or use case. Please check out the website bit.ly/Azure22 for more information. And we do have some limited travel scholarships to attend. Next, the South Big Data Innovation Hub Roundtable next month will be held on Thursday, May 24th from noon to 1:15 p.m. Eastern, and it will focus on data science, recruitment, retention, and diversity. To register in advance for our next roundtable or to view the recording of previous roundtables, so to answer some people's questions, yes, this roundtable has been videotaped and will be archived and available on our YouTube channel. Please visit bit.ly//South Hub Roundtables. We have some additional events coming up in June, Washington, D.C., including a workshop on community-driven citizen science focused on health and the environment, in collaboration with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We will have a Big Data Hub panel on the Picasso conference, so looking at research collaborations between the US big data research community and the European big data research community, particularly some of the private sector folks. And lastly, we have the upcoming Big Data PI, Big Data Hub PI meeting, June 20th through the 22nd, hosted by the National Science Foundation of Washington, D.C. And Renata, you have, I think, some upcoming events?
Yeah, so also this summer we're running a Data Up program that was part of a series called Keeping Data Science Broad that people can look at on our YouTube channel as well, that works with community colleges, small liberal arts schools, and technical colleges to look at their upskilling capacity for data science. So some of these things that you're talking about, Gordon, or those that are interested in the future of work, we want to expand that group to really get them more engaged. So we're providing data science training to 7 universities this year, as well as training in November that will coincide with getting faculty upskilled to teach data science in their particular setting. So I think this discussion on the future of work is really relevant, especially to that community as well. So we hope to see you there, or hope to see you as part of that initiative as well.
Great. And the PEPI program, the application's already due or done?
So that will happen in the fall. There's a program they're running for faculty to do fellowships with industry. So short-term fellowships with industry and now government. So it's PEPI-G now, where you can provide short-term stints where you work with inside of the company or inside of the government agency to really get a sense of their data structure and their data needs to further your research and that relationship. Okay. So that's something to look out for as well.
Great. And those of you who are joining us new to the Hub, we have up here on the slide how you can participate. You can email us and also get on our listserv. We have a monthly newsletter with all these kinds of opportunities that we've talked about today, a Twitter account, so do follow us on Twitter. And if you want to follow up with us, there is a NSF grants program called the SPOKE, Big Data Spoke program, which should be announced, I think, sometime in the fall, if we're hopeful. So if you want to learn more about that, let us know. info@southbdhub.org. Thank you all.
Thank you.